Welcome to today's webinar, Creating Reports with Excel's PowerPivot. Greg Lutes has been a technical trainer and consultant for almost 20 years. Greg has extensive experience with many types of desktop and server software and equipment. He is considered an expert in SharePoint and Office 365 technologies. His patient demeanor, combined with a passion for technology and practical knowledge, enable him to deliver productive and engaging learning experiences for all in attendance. So now I'm going to hand it over to Greg so he can tell us all about Excel's PowerPivot.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Greg Lutes, and today's webinar obviously is creating reports with Excel's PowerPivot. First, we'll talk about exactly how you enable PowerPivot within the application, and that'll actually show us a couple of other things that you can enable as well. Then we'll talk about importing data, linking tables, relationships, and then we'll move on to what are called DAX formulas. Stands for dynamic expression. Then we're going to take a look at something called get and transform. Get data is kind of retired now. So now what you have is a new section in Excel that is actually called Power Query, and it's called get and transform, and we'll take a look at that. And then what we'll do is we'll talk about distributing PowerPivot reports and exactly how that's done and where the data is actually kept. So when we do importing, I'm going to show you a couple of differences when you're importing large amounts of data and small amounts of data with what Excel now does with it. So there's some interesting stuff that happens. At any time, you are more than welcome to ask questions. I know that Sarah will try and stop me at different points to convey some of your questions. So don't hesitate. All right, let's get started. Okay, first off, how do you get PowerPivot? You'll notice I've got PowerPivot. I've also got something called Inquire as well. And how you get these things is you got to go to File. When you click on File on the left-hand side at the bottom, you got Options. Once you go to Options, you have something called add-ins. Now, when you click on add-ins, don't be alarmed. It might take a minute or so, but eventually it shows up. You got a bunch. These are all add-ins like plugins or extensions or extra things that extend the functionality. So when you come in here, don't be afraid to turn everything on. All right, you're not going to hurt anything. You'd figure it was Excel add-ins, and some of them are, but what we're looking for are actually COM add-ins. All you got to do is click on Go and put a check mark in everything. You're not going to hurt anything. You got Inquire, which is like an audit for a spreadsheet. You got Power Map, which is for creating three-dimensional maps. You got Power Pivot, which is why you're here today. And you also got Power View. And all you got to do is put check marks in them all and click OK. Now, bit of a side note, all right? When we teach this stuff and we do different things, we make sure that, you know, in class, everything's perfect and everything works and you have a great experience. When you get back to your desk, sometimes software doesn't act or work like it was advertised. And I want to give you a heads up here. At some point, you're going to have a problem with Excel, okay? And I wish I could narrow down exactly what that problem is going to be, but all of a sudden, Excel's going to act odd, all right? You're not going to be able to switch sheets, or you're working in PowerPivot, but you're not seeing data in a certain column, or you get an error message, a COM error message. There's a bunch of different symptoms, and like I said, I really wish I could narrow it down for you, but at some point, if you find that Excel is working odd, that something's not working the way that you figured it would, you're going to have to close Excel. You're going to have to reopen it. You're going to have to go to these COM add-ins, and you're going to have to uncheck them all. Then you close Excel, you open Excel back up, and you put the check marks back in. It's almost like it needs a reset with some of these features sometimes. I've seen it in 2013. It's quite prevalent in 2013. 2016, it tends to calm down a little bit, but I still see it. I've been using 2019 only for a couple of weeks now, and I haven't run into it, and I use this stuff every day. So anyways, just practical experience. You're going to have to come in here, put the check marks in. Anyways, I'll click OK, and you get PowerPivot. You also get Inquire. All right. Now I got to take a bit of a step back, okay? What I've done is I've imported a table called orders, and I've imported a table called customers. These come from a database, an Access database. But here's what I want to show you. These are all inside of what's called a table, all right? You create tables by going to Home and choosing Format as Table. But let me show you exactly what I mean, okay? I'm going to make a small table here, and I'll have items and quantity, price, and total, okay? So for items, I've got apple, banana, and kiwi. And I've got 30, 40, and 50 of these things. Apples, we got them at, say, 20 cents. Bananas, we got them for 10 cents. And kiwi, we got them for 15 cents, okay? All right. In Excel, everything has to go in a table, everything. So that means that you got to go to Home, you got to use this button and format everything in Excel as a table, like that. Every table has to have a name. If I click in the table name here, I'm going to call this items, okay? But everything in Excel must go into a table. If it doesn't go into a table, it doesn't work. Excel doesn't get it. It doesn't work properly. If you see the word subtotal on a spreadsheet, rest assured the person that made it had no idea what they were doing in Excel. All right? Got to go into a table. It's how you get it into PowerPivot. Tables. You add tables to your data model. Your data model is where you want to keep all of your data, manage all of your data, and manage the relationships between the different sets of data. But the only way to get there is to format it as a table. And think about it logically. Do you really want to use a paint bucket to color all those different cells? The paint bucket is used for accents. That's it, right? If I want to point this out, that's what the paint bucket's for. You got 16.3 million cells. You really want to use a paint bucket? See? I can change the colors, but the only thing that doesn't change is what's done with the paint bucket. It's for highlighting. Now to fix that, you can click on a cell that you've never clicked on before and use your format painter. Just paint over top of that. That'll fix it. All right. DAX formulas refer to, the big part of DAX formulas is that they refer to different columns in the table. And the way that it does that is very, very similar to SQL, to SQL. So for those of you that know how to write SQL, this is going to look like old hat to you. For those that don't know how to write SQL, this is a great introduction, and you might actually like the formula better. See, normally you'd write the formula equals B2 times C2, right? Quantity times price. The problem with that is those are abstract addresses. Not only that, they're also absolute. So if somebody inserts a row, inserts a column, it messes up with formulas. Instead, you use DAX formulas, you use named formulas, named ranges, like this, equals QTY for quantity, close the squared bracket, and that's how you refer to a column inside of a table. Equals opening squared bracket, QTY, you close the squared bracket, times price. Everybody, as an instructor, this is so much easier to teach people. This is easier for people to wrap their head around because you already knew this. I didn't have to explain that to you, quantity times price. But you got to sit in a class and I got to tell you, okay, type in equals class, B2 times C2. With this, you get it. And it doesn't take long for people to learn the formulas when you're using names. Now, the real magic happens when you hit your enter key. It copies it all the way down. So if I have another item like orange, I can put in the quantity, I can put in the price, and I don't have to put in the rest of the formula. It does it automatically. If we need a total, I head back to design, I put the check mark in there, there's the total. But that's a DAX formula. And that's a heck of a lot easier for me to teach, and it's a heck of a lot easier for you to understand when you inherit somebody else's stuff. If it's all these abstract cell addresses, you have to decipher the formula. Right? So, in a nutshell, that's DAX. We'll do a little bit more later. All right, here's the other issue we run into, okay? Here I've got a list of orders, all right? And my boss turns to me and says, look, Greg, need you to do a pivot table. Great. So I'll make a pivot table out of orders. It's in a table. The name of the table is called orders. I'll stick it in a new worksheet. All right, I'll make a pivot table. So I can take the order ID, drop that into the row, and then I can take, say, the customer ID, drop that over top of the order ID, and maybe my boss is curious about the shipping fees that we're paying right now, so I'll drop that into values. I don't know, maybe he's interested in the ship date as well, so I could drop that into columns. Anyways, there's my pivot table. Now the issue is my boss turns to me and says, oh, okay, well, what are these numbers? Well, those are the order IDs. Okay, well, what are these? Well, these are the customer IDs. The order ID, easily explained, but the customer ID, we don't know who customer number 1 is or customer number 4. Who's customer number 6? For that, we need the customer table. But I can't use a second table in a pivot table. Not the way that Excel was originally built. So what did you have to do? Well, I had to create a lookup, right? I had to look up the customer ID inside the customer table and come back with the customer name. So I'd have to create another column. Call the column customer name. And customer name would be a VLOOKUP. So VLOOKUP, opening bracket. What are you trying to look up? Well, I'm trying to look up customer ID, comma, sorry, customer ID, close my bracket, there we go, comma. Well, what table? It's from customers. The column index number, right? Which column do you want returned back to? I'd like the customer name, right? Company name, which is the second column, comma. Range lookup is always false, unless you're trying to look for a range of numbers. So it comes back with the company name. Okay, the company names aren't that inventive, but those are the different company names. And now I could go back to my pivot table. Might have to do a bit of a refresh here. And when I do, what I should have is I should have the company name. And then instead of the customer ID number, right, which is useless to us, we can take the company name and do this. But see how much work that is? Well, what if he wants to know what products they ordered? What if he wants to know, the rest of the order's information? And I'm going to have to keep creating these lookups. And that's where PowerPivot comes in. PowerPivot helps us to manage a data model. In essence, it allows us to bring SQL inside of Excel. PowerPivot can crunch 100 million rows of records. You try and put 100 million rows inside of Excel, you're going to kill it. You try and drop 1 million rows into Excel, you're going to kill it. You're not going to be able to open the thing again. You already have spreadsheets that are slow when you open them. So here's the other part. If you head to your data tab, there's a brand new section here that's called Get and Transform. Now it's only here if you have 2016. If you have 2013, you're going to have to turn it on the same way that we turned it on with PowerPivot. So at 2013, you head to File, you go to Options, it's part of your add-ins, and you'll see it. It's part of the COM add-ins. It's called Power Query. But this is it.
And if you're
And
on a
here,
version that's earlier than 2013, where would you find that?
you'd have to download it. So if you have Excel 2010, then you're going to have to download PowerPivot, Power Query, and Power Map. So you're going to have to talk to IT on that one. They're going to have to give you a hand. But once you do, you can import from all kinds of different files, SharePoint folders, lots of different databases. You can import from the Azure cloud, different online services, and lots of other sources. So here's our dilemma, all right? I got orders, I got customers. I don't want to have to do this whole lookup thing, so I had the data. I go to Get Data, and I grab the data from an Access database. That's where orders and customers originally came from. I had to import them, and once I imported them, I could do my charts and graphs and pivot tables and all the rest of it. If I choose Microsoft Access Database, I can find Northwind. There it is. Once I find Northwind, I can select multiple items just by using the check mark at the top here, and there's customers, there's orders, wouldn't mind order details, and some products, employees. So the idea, you import whatever you want. Now, when you import whatever you want, this is the tricky part. In fact, this is the hardest part of PowerPivot. You're going to need a way of relating all these different tables, or else you can't use them. So what you're going to have to learn is database relationships, data relationships. Head to YouTube, type in data relationships, and sit back, watch the show. But you're going to have to learn them. You're going to have to study them in order to get your data to all match. Like I said, in class and with these examples, we make sure that everything's perfect, and we've done it 100 times before. In reality, you're going to run into issues with your data, I promise. I do this way too often, and it doesn't matter how big or how small your company is, you're going to have to learn how to do this, and you're not going to like what you find with your data sometimes. And that's where Power Query comes in. Power Query comes in when you click on Edit. So if there's data that I don't like, if there's data that I don't want, if there's something wrong with the data, I can get in here and click on Edit. Of course, it opens on my other monitor. All right, there we are. When I click on Edit, these are all my different tables. I've imported the customer table twice, and whatever, but you get the idea. All right, here's products. There's a list of my products table. And if I see different things that I don't agree with or I don't like, this is my chance to fix them. So I can get in here and change what I need to, fix what I need to, or not import different parts. There's no sense in importing columns if there's no information within the column. And I may have different things that I really don't feel like importing. The other thing it does is it shows me other relationships that this table already has with other tables like inventory transactions, another table called order details, and another one called purchase order details. Now this is a class onto itself, all right? But just to give you a quick example here, I can click here, and here I've got the product name. And what they've done is they've typed in Northwind Traders, which is brutal, right? That's horrible. So what I want to do is I want to replace the values. Now I can't do it in the original database because for some odd reason, we need to have our company name in front of all the product names. But when I do reports, it looks silly. So I can just type it in, Northwind space traders, and I put in another space. Right? I don't want a space before the name, so I want to take that space out. I'm going to replace it with nothing and click OK. And I do this because I'm not allowed to change this in the original database. I call the IT guys, they say, look, it messes up my reports, it looks ugly, and they say, too bad. Right? We can't change it, we need it for this report, or this person needs it for this. So fine. They can keep it the way they want to keep it, but when we pull this in, it remembers to replace the values. Every time I hit refresh, it goes back into the database, reconnects to the database, grabs any more products that's missing from this table, and replaces Northwind Traders in front of the name of the product. So I never have to do this again. I can then close and load this into my data model. And the data model is managed by PowerPivot. Now, when I do it this way, right, it imports products, right? There's order details, and drops them into all these different sheets, right? If I go to PowerPivot, and if I click on Manage, slowly but surely, sometimes it takes a little bit to open PowerPivot, especially the first time that you click onto it. This is PowerPivot. It's a separate window. So as I said, to get things into my data model, all I've got to do is click on the table and add it to the data model. The other thing that I could have done is I could have imported this directly into PowerPivot. And the reason that I would do it from here is because I don't want to make any changes. There's nothing that I want to replace. There's nothing that I want to do. The data is completely perfect. So I dump it in here. The reality, your data is not going to be perfect. You're going to want to take things out. You're going to want to remove different things. And that's the reason for Get and Transform. This is going to help you clean your data. If the data is already clean, then jump right into PowerPivot and away you go. Now I can just take, all these different tables that I've imported, and I can add them to my data model. Right? There's employees, and now it sits in my data model. Of course, I can label this employees. This is my products table, and I can add this to my data model as well. This one is orders. And I've already got an order, so I'm just going to call it orders. I'll call it orders 2 to match. Oh, sorry, this is order details, isn't it? Yeah, order details, sorry. Sorry about that. Order details. And this one is orders, so I'm just going to call this orders 2. This one is going to be customers 2. Spelled correctly. So I got orders, right? Order details. There's my products and my employees. I've added employees. I've added products to the data model. Here I can add order details. Right? That goes in nicely. There's orders, right? Orders 2. I'll drop that into the data model. Right? There's orders 2. And customers. So again, the idea is that you just do an absolute ton of importing. You import all kinds of different data from all kinds of different places. And once you're finished with that, you got to head to your diagram view. Because in the diagram view is where you're going to have to create the relationships between all the different tables. For those of you that are familiar with Access, this is also going to look familiar to you as well. Now, to do this requires an intimate knowledge of your data. If you do not have that intimate knowledge of your data, you got to go find somebody that does, or you got to figure it out yourself. But this takes a lot of practice, and this takes knowledge of the database. There's my orders table. There's order details. My products table, my customers table. In the orders table, I have customer ID. In the orders table, I have just ID. You'd have to know that they're the same thing, but I can click, drag, and create a relationship between the two. Now I can use orders and I can use customers inside of a pivot table, but I can't use the rest of these yet. Inside order details is order ID. Inside of orders is order ID. These are the same thing. I create a relationship between the two, and it creates a one-to-many relationship. This is also referred to as an equijoin or a parent and child relationship. Order details has product ID. In products, it's just called ID. You'd have to know that. I'd click, drag, and create a relationship between the two. Orders and employees. I can click on ID in employees. I can drag it right on top of employee ID in orders. And now it's all connected. All connected. And once it's all connected, you can now use it in a great big pivot table. As if all of this was just one great big table. There's other things that you can do in here as well to kind of set everybody up for success. Obviously, the person that does this has to have an intimate knowledge of the database and the data. To build a pivot table, you also really need to understand the data. See, sometimes with data, there's a hierarchy. Sometimes the hierarchy is very obvious, and sometimes the hierarchy is not so obvious. For instance, in orders, I have the country, the state, and the city. That's a hierarchy.
Oh, we're getting a few questions before you move on to hierarchies about creating the relationships. Does it matter which one you select as the one in a one-to-many relationship?
No, PowerPivot will figure out which one has the primary key and which one is the secondary key.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem. I would like to build a hierarchy. The hierarchy is going to make it easier for people to create a pivot table. After all, pivot tables are really just grouping information. So a hierarchy is really just a grouping. In orders, I have country, state, and city. So if I click this button here, this creates a hierarchy. The hierarchy needs a name, so I will call it CSC. Country, state, city. I'll click on country, drag country, drop it right to CSC. And when you do this, you have to drop it right on top of the name. So not underneath it, right on top, or it doesn't work. Then I take the state, I click, I drag, and I drop the state again right on top of CSC. City is next, so I click on city and I drag it and drop it right on top of CSC. Now I've got a hierarchy. In products, I could grab and create a hierarchy as well. But in here, the hierarchy is definitely not, or might not be, as obvious. In products, I can click the button to create the hierarchy. And the hierarchy can be D for discontinued, C for category, and P for product name. So DCP. I'll click on discontinued. I'll drag discontinued and drop it onto DCP.
And for the hierarchy, is the order important, or can you change the order?
You can change the order, but no, the order is definitely important. And that's why you're doing this, is because you're the expert, you know the order, and you're going to help everybody else out by creating this new field that's going to give them a hierarchy to work with. Here's category and product name. The other thing that we can do for people while we're in here, we can remove different fields that don't make sense to keep. See, these ID fields, nobody wants those in, well, at least most of them anyways. Nobody really wants most of these inside of a pivot table. The order ID makes sense because it's something quite concrete and something we're all aware of. But an employee ID or a customer ID isn't something that's kind of common knowledge. So I'm going to right click on top of the product ID and hide it. Right? Most people know the product name, not the product ID. Same with the employee ID. Nobody really needs the employee ID, they need their names. So I can hide the ID so nobody uses the ID.
And within the hierarchy, can you show us how you would make changes to that after you've created them?
The fields can be dragged around as long as the hierarchy moving around makes sense. You can just click and drag and move them around.
Okay, so if you establish the hierarchy but need to make changes, you can click and drag them around to do that.
Oh gosh, yes. Yeah, no
Okay.
issues. There's other ID fields that I really don't need, right? And I can get rid of those. The order ID I need in here, but the ID field for order ID details, I don't need this one. So the whole point is that you go through and you hide different fields that wouldn't be useful in this data model. Right? You're trying to keep them on the straight and narrow. You're trying to make sure that when they drag different fields in, they're going to get something. Now to see this, I head to pivot table, right? I choose pivot table just like normal. Just like normal, it asks me, where do you want to create it? Brand new worksheet. That sounds terrific. But the difference is that I now have a hierarchy that I can use. I can take the order ID from order details and drag the order ID into rows. And then if I wish to see, say, I don't know, which products they ordered, I can either use DCP if I want that kind of detail, or I can go to more fields and just drag what I need, like the product name. Drag it underneath the order ID. I'll need one more field to kind of help me out with this. And let's see, let's take quantity, drop it into values and unit price.
So another question, after you've established the relationships, what happens with the original data? So if the original data updates, do you see that in real time?
Uh, Not exactly in real time. You'll have to hit a refresh button. So in Analyze here, right, I can go to Analyze and I can hit refresh here.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Now, of course, I've got quantity, I've got price, but what I don't have is a line total. Right? That's not in my original data. So once again, I can rely on DAX formulas, and I can go back to PowerPivot, I can go back to Manage, and to create a DAX formula, you're going to have to go to the data view. When I go to the data view, I'll head to Order Details. That's where I've got quantity and unit price. And in Order Details, I can add a brand new column. To add the new column, I use a DAX formula. Equals, equals, opening squared bracket, quantity. Close the squared bracket, times, opening squared bracket, unit price. Now it's given it an ugly name, calculated column 1, but we can right click on that, we can rename that, and we can call it line total.
And can you show us how you'd use a hierarchy?
Absolutely. I want to do one more thing to this thing. I'm going to format this for currency. And unit price should also be currency too. There we go. Now I got a new field. Unit price is now formatted properly, so I didn't have to do that in the pivot table, so that's kind of nice. I got this thing called line total. I can just add that to my values. Now, as far as the hierarchy goes with, say, the other table here, right, my customer table, let me show you how that works. So I'm just going to insert another sheet here. I'll make another pivot table. Choose pivot table. I'll use the data model, and I'll use this existing worksheet. So sheet 3, it's going to throw it into A1. All right. So here, I'm going to take orders, and in orders, I have CSC. I can take that, and I can drop that into columns. Then I can go to more fields. And let's see, let's take shipping fee. We'll drop that into here. And then let's take the company name from customers. I'll take company and drop it into rows. All right. So here what it's done is it's created a data hierarchy. Country, if I click the plus, state, I can click the plus for, say, Nevada, and see Las Vegas. Or Colorado. Click the plus for Colorado and see Denver. Illinois. I got Chicago. And And that's my hierarchy. Boise, Idaho. And that's how my hierarchy works. I do have buttons to help collapse the field. So I can hit minus and it folds all the states up, or I can hit expand and that folds out all the states, all the cities in the states. And of course, I can click on USA and I can fold that up. And of course, some of shipping hasn't been formatted correctly, so I can go to my value field settings, go to number format, and format that for currency too. So it all looks proper. Now, of course, a pivot table is also clickable. So let's see, I've got a shipping fee of $624. If I double click on this, it creates a brand new sheet and a brand new table and extracts the information. So it shows the shipping fee for company F and shows me all the details from orders. It actually extracts that information from orders and shows it to me. So I don't have to go back to that table and try and search for company F's orders. Here they are right here. And that's just a normal functionality of how a pivot table works.
And can you show that just one more time, please?
Of course. So I'm sitting with my boss, right? And my boss turns to me and he says, company AA, $400 in shipping fees? Really? What did they order? I can double click on it and it extracts that information and I can say, well, that's the order ID. That's the employee that took it, right? There's the order date. And if I need to, this is a brand new table. I can just use this data and put this data in a chart, in a pivot table, or whatever I want, or I can add this table to my data model, create a relationship between it and the customers or it and the employees, and get further information on who is customer 27. And all I had to do was double click. But the reason that I have that and that amount of information that I do in the pivot table is thanks to the hierarchy. And this saves the person having to drag in 3 different fields: country, state, province, and city. They just dragged in 1 field instead of dragging 3 fields into columns and having to get the hierarchy right in the columns so that they get this right. In PowerPivot, when you do the DAX formulas here instead of the spreadsheet, your data is managed much more efficiently here. Your memory is managed much more efficiently here when you're doing the DAX formula inside of this program rather than Excel. Excel has to keep track of 16.3 million cells all the time. And if you have formulas in there, it's constantly calculating that formula, and that eats up your computer's memory and makes the spreadsheet slow. If you can do as many calculations as possible inside of PowerPivot, this helps. Any questions about any of this stuff?
Okay. I'm going to go back to a question if that's okay. What is the preferred way to gather data from 30 spreadsheet or separate Excel documents? Okay, sorry. 30 separate Excel documents of application inventories that are stored in SharePoint. Like, would you extract it to a single Excel sheet?
No, what I probably would do is I would use some Excel, and I would use Excel head to data, head to get and transform, and I get the information from a SharePoint folder.
Okay, so if they're all in one folder, you can select it there and
You
bring them
got it.
in.
You got it. A list is another thing that you can do, is you can import data from a SharePoint list, and that's another option if the data has been extracted as a list in SharePoint. So if it's in a folder or a library, you can grab the information that way. If it's a list in SharePoint, if it's something that's been converted to a list, then you can grab the information from a list.
Okay. I have another one here. So can I import Excel tables instead of databases into PowerPivot?
Absolutely. The same thing. I can go to PowerPivot, and they kind of do it odd, especially because it is an Excel file, but it's like one of the last things that you can do. So when you go from other sources, it's one of the last things that's listed is an Excel file.
So then from there, you would just select the file that has the table in it.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay.
And it would show you the different sheets as well. And when you click on the different sheets, you see the data, you see the tables that's on the sheet. So that way, if you can't remember, oh shoot, what sheet is it on? You at least get a bit of a preview with it too.
So going to one of the pivot tables you'd created, how would you add like border to that?
I'm sorry, say that again.
So for a pivot table, so this one here, how would you go about adding a border to it? Or is that kind of non-standard?
Sure. I mean, go to home, uh, use this stuff.
Okay.
So yeah, nothing fancy. Your best bet, in all honesty, is to use design. Use design, and it sounds horrible the way I'm going to say it, but I can't think of any other way to say it. Be happy with these, in all honesty. If you're working with 5 or 6 rows, then yeah, go ahead, and you can use your time to use a paint bucket and do this individually if you got 4 or 5 rows. But if you got a couple hundred rows, you really don't want to be using any of this stuff that sits in font to be doing any of that stuff. That is just that's a lot of work for you to do. Instead, concentrate on design and concentrate on either using the styles that are here or creating your own style. Because you also want to be consistent too. If you're creating other pivot tables and you've put a frame around one, you should really put a frame around all of them then. In business, you need consistency out of that company. People can't be coloring things in however they want, or it's not going to look professional coming out of the company. You need your colors, you need a brand, you need to look a certain way. So no matter who makes a pivot table in your company, all your pivot tables look the same. And styles will help you out with that.
Alrighty. So I have a couple of requests to see if we can get access to the data that you're using. So can you share where you pulled that data?
You mean for the first 2 tables?
Yes.
This one, this I got from that same database, right? So these are identical, right? Customers, 2 customers. I got these from the same database. So all I did is I did the exact same thing. I went to data, I went to get data from database, and that's all I did. Nothing special. Choose Northwind. And these are all queries or views in the database. So I don't have a list of my suppliers, so I'll load that. But when you do that, you're going to have to go into PowerPivot. You're going to have to manage that data model. And somehow you're going to have to create a relationship with one of these other tables. All of the tables have to be linked together, because if they're not linked together, they don't work. You can't use your model. Your model is invalid. It won't work properly.
Okay. I think that answers that question. But while you're on showing your relationships here, can you, what other pieces of data would you create hierarchies around besides a location? Like, would date make sense? Or are there any other fields that you can think of?
Well, this was one example. Discontinued, category, product name. That's one example. You could use date fields, name fields, phone number fields. It depends on your data. So if you're confused about data hierarchies, you really need to watch a couple of videos on database management and database relationships, because the people that work with this, the qualifications to work with PowerPivot, you understand databases. If you don't understand databases, you're going to need to either take a course in databases or watch a bunch of videos to learn how to work with data, create data hierarchies, create different database relationships and different data relationships with different data types. So if you're not familiar with databases, you've got a bit of learning to do in order to be able to use this properly. Any other questions?
Okay, I do have a few here, but I know we are running late on time. So for anybody who needs to leave, please go ahead. We're gonna do, I'll say like two more questions before, two or three before we close off. But this is recorded, and we will be sending out the recording to everyone. So you'll get that as an extra resource after. Okay, so if you want to create columns that are not sums, but just bringing values from, bringing together values that were disconnected sheets, do you need an outside pivot table? Or do you need to be outside a pivot and basically that would just be a VLOOKUP?
I'm not. Could you state the question again, please?
Yes. Okay, so if you want to create columns that are not sums, but just bringing values from what before were disconnected sheets, do we need to be outside of a pivot and basically use VLOOKUP?
A pivot is simply a report. And as far as a pivot table is concerned, all of that information comes from a single table. And by creating relationships between these different data sets, between these different tables, I'm able to use whichever field I want in order to build a pivot table. So if your data is not in one of these tables, you've got to figure a way of getting it into that table. Whether it's cutting and pasting it or doing a VLOOKUP in the table itself. But the idea is that once you're looking at this model, everything's perfect. So it has to be perfect before it comes here.
Okay. So another question is, if you're going through this and you're not getting the results that you expect when you're creating a pivot table, let's put that in an example, what's the best way to troubleshoot errors? Or how do you work through troubleshooting?
To be very honest, if you're having trouble building a pivot table, then you need to watch videos on how to manage data, data relationships, how to use a database, because that it all relates back. When I work with different people that build databases, and then I introduce this makes sense to us. We just look at this and we're like, oh yeah, no problem. Pivot table, yeah, sure, no problem. And it's because we understand how data is grouped, how data is related to each other, and how different data types interact and react to different types. So that's the part that you're missing. In order to troubleshoot it, you'd have to take it to somebody that understands data and understands relationships and databases.
Okay. All right, so here's someone who received an actual error message. So relationship cannot be created because each column contains duplicate values.
You got it.
How would you approach resolving that issue?
I'm going to sound like a broken record. Because the key thing, you're having an error with your relationship. So that means that you've tried to create a relationship that is invalid, which means that you don't understand the data that you have in front of you. You've got to watch videos to help you understand data types, data relationships, how to relate data to different tables. So you're going to have to learn how to manage a database.
Okay, so it's a combination of really getting to know the data that you're working with and
Yes.
then knowing best practices for the data in general.
Not even best practices. You have to understand what's the difference between a one-to-one relationship, a one-to-many relationship, a many-to-many relationship, a left join, a right join, an inner join, an outer join. The list kind of goes on and on and on. And that's why I'm saying you have to learn that subject. You have to learn that topic, because there's a lot of different things that are going on here. And if you don't understand what's happening, you're going to continue to get error messages in your pivot tables. This is two different skills. Somebody that's good at Excel is not necessarily good at this. Somebody that's good at databases but not good at Excel is good at this.
Okay, so this will be the last one that we're going to tackle before we close off our webinar. Does each column have to have one relationship, or can we have multiple relationships between columns?
You can have multiple relationships between tables. You cannot have relationships between columns. Once again, go to YouTube or take a course and watch some videos on database relationships, data relationships, and managing a database. And that'll take a lot of the mystery out of making pivot tables, because unfortunately, pivot tables have been presented as another type of chart or graph, and it isn't. A pivot table, by definition, is the grouping of data and the relationships of data inside of a table. So it has more to do with databases than it does a spreadsheet, which is confusing.
a little bit, but
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure as you go and dive into these things, you just need to give yourself the time to learn and get used to it.
You do like this is not something you learn overnight. This is not learning a bar graph or a pie chart. This is a massive, massive topic. I've only hit on a couple of things here, a couple of different add-ins, but those add-ins that I've talked about, those are either 1 to 2 days of training. So, you know, inside of an hour, you're not going to really and truly kind of pick this up unless you're used to managing data and database relationships and you're a DBA, and then, you know, showing you this, it's like, oh yeah, yeah, okay, I've used this before. This is neat. Oh wow, you got this in Excel now. Cool.